There is absolutely no way to go about this topic without upsetting somebody, but I respect my audience. I gotta be completely honest, and I gotta break down the situation with the defense as objectively and impartially as possible. You may notice my voice is a little off. I'm getting over the flu. I'm pretty sure that's what I had anyway, judging by the symptoms I had and everything. A couple of days ago, y'all wouldn't have been able to understand me at all. I know I still sound a little bit like Squidward right now, but I'm getting better. I initially planned on driving down and going to the game today, and unfortunately that didn't happen. So I'm going to try to go to one sometime within the near future. But for right now, I'm going to enjoy watching the Hurricanes and the Penguins from the comfort of my own home. Now, I will be perfectly honest with you guys. If this is your first time here, you know that I like every player on this team. Particularly Jaccob Slavin, Brett Pesce, Brent Burns, and Tony DeAngelo are four of my favorite players, especially in the modern era. Jalen Chatfield is also now on that list, especially after his performance last year. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I have frequently praised him as being someone who struggled to get to the league, and I feel like it's wrong for him to be benched. Now, I'm going to take a look at the depth chart here, and I want to talk about the defensive pairings that the Hurricanes are using tonight. I want to talk about the pairings that they've used in the past when Pesce was out with his lower body injury, and talk about what they could look like and who I think is actually the most viable person to get traded, because I feel like the logjam on the blue line is the biggest contributing factor as to why we're not seeing the Hurricanes have sustained success. Alright, so this is the pairings that were ran during the morning skate and is apparently what is going to go tonight, with Chatfield being the healthy extra for the defense and Brendan Lemieux being the healthy extra for the forwards. Now, like I said, let me make it abundantly clear, I like everybody on this blue line. I would like for all of them to be able to stay. That's not feasible with Nikishin and Morrow coming in eventually, although Morrow could be next season and Nikishin is at least 2 seasons away. But here's something that I really have to look at here. The Orlov and DeAngelo pair is not working. I'm sorry, but it's not. There's a lot of team defense deficiencies right now, but the Orlov and DeAngelo pair is a glaring issue. Orlov is not going to get benched, at least not for very long, no matter how bad it may look like he plays, because he's getting paid nearly $8 million. That's not happening. DeAngelo's only making $1.6 million, but he has noted defensive deficiencies. No one's denying that. Everyone knows it, including him. So, looking at what has worked. The other night when they were playing the Flyers, what little bit of it I saw, because I was starting to get sick around that time, so I want to say around the end of the second period, I was watching but not paying attention. I was just kind of mindlessly sitting at the TV knowing I was coming down with something. From what I did see, though, the Slavin and Burns pair was the only ones that seemed pretty consistent. Brent Burns, in particular, made a couple of excellent defensive plays that he was on his back for, breaking up odd man rushes. He did stuff that you normally see Jaccob Slavin do. Additionally, Jaccob Slavin had a good night breaking up entries and everything like that. So that pair, I understand the rationale why it has to stay together, and part of what Brind'Amour said also extends over into the second pair, and we already know from last season, and the little bit of a sample size we've had this season, although it hasn't lived up to last season just yet, that Skjei and Pesce is about the best second pair you could ask for, and a lot of other teams would kill to have that for a top pair. So here's where we have to start asking the tough questions. If I'm going to apply Occam's razor to this, the Hurricanes have strived for, and for the most part built, a type of defense that most NHL teams strive for. 3 right-handed defensemen, 3 left-handed defensemen, with an offensive puck-moving type of defenseman paired with a safety valve shutdown type of defenseman. Where that has an exception is the third pair. The simple solution to that is to put Chatfield in with Orlov. In my opinion, Chatfield being with Orlov has been an improvement. The Chatfield and Orlov pair has not seen a ton of extensive testing. I think now's the time that you got to do it because Chatfield's got to play. It's not fair that he's getting benched. It's also not fair that Tony is getting benched because he has his merits to the game as well. But as far as what the Hurricanes need to do right now, I think that there's a greater focus that needs to be laid on stabilizing the defensive issues. That great ability that the Hurricanes had at preventing transition and denying zone entries, They have to get back to that before they really even worry about the power play. And even if you take Tony DeAngelo out of the lineup, you have 3 viable options back there to quarterback the power play. Primarily, you have Burns being one, Orlov being another, and if it comes right down to it, Brady Shea has shown in the past he can quarterback the power play and is a great tertiary option in that regard. Now, it does not just come down to simply benching DeAngelo. If you're going to bench him, and the same goes for Chatfield, if you're going to continue to bench him, I think that it's the only rational thing to do to, 1, get some money off the books, and 2, neither one of these guys need to be sitting. They're both viable NHL defensemen, and he's a playmaker. He has his place in the game. If he's going to sit, he needs to go elsewhere. Same thing with Chatfield. Jalen Chatfield has proven that he has excellent aggressive gap control. He's proving that he can be a penalty killer, and he's showing elements of being a playmaker himself now. More than anything, he is very stalwart defensively. He's very tenacious on puck carriers. Jalen Chatfield and Tony DeAngelo combined are like the perfect right-handed, or like the perfect second pair right-handed defenseman. But someone has to go. I'm sorry, but I'm resolute at that in this point. This logjam has to be cleared up. Someone's sitting when they shouldn't be. Y'all know how much I like Tony. But the only rational thing to do at this point, in my opinion, is to put Chatfield in the lineup over him. If the defensive issues do not get solved, the Hurricanes will not win games. The Hurricanes are built entirely on forechecking, preventing zone exits, disrupting neutral zone transmission, denying entry, and standing tall in their own defensive zone. That's why they've won so many of those close games, and games that should be absolute nail-biters. The Hurricanes were winning plenty of those low-scoring games. They cannot build on what they're doing right now, in my opinion. They need to get back to that. They need to get back to all the aforementioned things, get back to their identity. And unfortunately, I think for that to happen, Tony DeAngelo has to come out of the lineup. Now, he knew it was going to be between him and Chatfield. He said as much. He knew it was going to be between him and Chatfield as far as who the 6th man was going to be. I think taking a small hit on the power play right now is worth it to get the Hurricanes back to playing to their identity. As stated before by Brind'Amour and Jordan Staal, having buy-in, which it appears there isn't really a lot of buy-in right now. That is the simple solution. That is the solution that could be done immediately. Because, I'll be honest with you guys, I like both of them. If I'm Jalen Chatfield, I'm starting to get a little annoyed that I'm not in the lineup. Now, these pairings occurred while Pesce was out on injury. This was one of the combinations that they tried. The one that has been consistent and stayed together has been Slavin and Burns. I personally do not see any reason to break that one up just yet. Burns has shown a couple of lapses here and there, but I feel like the other night was a game that is more characteristic of him than... But I feel like the game versus Philadelphia was a little bit more characteristic of him defensively. He just couldn't get any shots through, but it seemed like no one on the team could get shots through because... Philadelphia had 30 blocked shots. It was more like Carolina threw 30 shots at Philadelphia players, hoping that something would eventually go through. Orlov has extensively, and Trip Tracy mentioned this during one broadcast when these defensive pairs were tried. I forget which game in particular. Orlov has extensively played on his right side despite being a left-handed defenseman and his degree of success. He also did so in Washington and Boston. Most recently Boston, obviously, but he did so in Washington at times as well. Additionally, Orlov was doing pretty well when he was paired with Nick Jensen, who is also a shutdown defenseman, when they were in Washington. As a matter of fact, I think you could argue that that was their best pair for quite some time. And then the last pair, 2 right-handed defensemen, had Tony DeAngelo and Jalen Chatfield. And one thing I noticed with these two in particular is that I felt like they actually interchanged really well. When one went to exit the zone, the other would cover open ice and make themselves a passing option, or go to the right spot to cover defensively in the event that a turnover got forced. I think it's kind of overlooked how well these pairs actually worked. The problem is, I don't know if this is sustainable. Having 2 left-handed defensemen on one pair, 2 right-handed defensemen on another, eventually teams are going to start picking that apart. Chatfield and Burnsy worked pretty well together, but I don't think that would have been sustainable forever either, when they played together for a little while last season. So in the event that you were to trade Pesce, this is one of the options you have. This is another defensive setup that worked relatively well while Pesce was out with an injury. In my opinion, though, this would also not be sustainable long-term. While Brady Shea and Tony DeAngelo are both pretty fast, they can both get back to cover any sort of defensive lapses. I don't think you have enough defensive mindedness between the two. They're both puck carriers. DeAngelo more than Shea. Shea is not a pure safety valve, but he is good enough defensively to be a safety valve for someone like DeAngelo in the event that you did trade Pesce. And then the third pair would be Orlov and Chatfield, and this would be about as even of a distribution as you would get without Pesce. Now, let's just say that you trade Shea and you keep the top pair the same. That would kind of offset things in terms of you would be down to 2 left-handed defensemen, whereas if you traded any of the right-handed defensemen, be it DeAngelo, Chatfield, or Pesce, you still have Coghlan down in the American League if you really need him. And that would also be another one. That would also add to the case to trade Tony DeAngelo, who fills the same role and who is in a lot of ways comparable. He's not as good as him, at least not yet, but a player who fills a comparable role in the minor leagues currently developing. Now, in the event you do that, you keep the top pair together, you slide Pesce in there with Orlov. This gives Orlov the safety valve that he needs, and I think that you see his production increase and his mistakes go down. And then after that, and the reason that I wanted to bring up the 2 pairs before, I felt like that the DeAngelo and Chatfield pair worked pretty well. Chatfield is also good enough defensively to where Tony DeAngelo can turn loose and be that freewheeling, puck-moving defenseman that he can be. Now, some people argue that the only person who can do that is Slavin. I disagree. I think Chatfield is good enough to be that guy as well. I think between the two of them having an aggressive style of play, albeit Chatfield's favors the defensive side of the game more, Tony's favors more of the getting the puck, moving it up ice, and making a play, I think that they could actually feed off each other really well if they did find themselves on the same pair. However, I do not find this to be the most efficient option either, and I would not trade Shea. Now, also, one other option you have in the event that you don't have Shea. Top pair stays the same. Chatfield goes with Orlov, and then you put Pesce with DeAngelo and let Pesce act as the safety valve for Tony DeAngelo. I also think that this would work decently, but I don't find it to be the absolute best pairing. Again, this is not as efficient of a solution as just moving out one of the right-handed defensemen. Out of the left-handed defensemen, Shea is the only one that I think would be moved. Slavin's not going anywhere. Those of you who think he's not going to resign, I'll eat my hat if I'm wrong, but I highly, highly doubt Jaccob Slavin ever gets moved or does not sign or does not stay with the Hurricanes. He's the most important defenseman on the team. He's quickly becoming the franchise defenseman of the team. He's one of the leaders. And to top off everything he does on the ice, he does a lot of stuff off the ice. He's very connected with the community in the Triangle. Jaccob Slavin is not going anywhere. All right, now to look into what we're looking at transactionally for any of these players. The 3 on the bottom, I think, are completely off the table and will not be touched. So, for example, Brent Burns, I don't think is going anywhere because he's important to the team in terms of leadership. He has produced more in a single season as the offensive right side defenseman with Jaccob Slavin than anyone else has thus far. Dmitry Orlov, the biggest reason, even though he does not have a no movement clause, the biggest reason I think that he will not be traded is, one, I don't think that we've seen everything that he's going to do yet. I think he's going to improve significantly as he continues to adapt to the system. I do think he needs to be paired with someone differently other than Tony DeAngelo. I think that we'll really start seeing his worth once he starts getting some more reps on the power play. And above all, if you sign someone to that kind of deal, albeit relatively short on term, but that much money, and they go through the time and the trouble to move their family and everything to Raleigh like he did, and then you just up and trade them, that's going to be off-putting for free agents in the future, and it took a long time for the Hurricanes to get to a point where they were a team that attracted big-name free agents. The last thing you want to do is potentially turn big-name free agents off in the future that are coming, especially when you can look at this and see how many expiring contracts there are just on the blue line alone. Granted, this is ultimately not going to be that much of a problem, as I think that Slavin will stay, one of Pesce or Chatfield will stay, Nikishin and Morrow are coming up, and the Hurricanes do have some assets to burn if they did have to trade for another defenseman, for example. And then Slavin, I already went over the reasons why I don't think he's going anywhere ever. I'm pretty sure he will, along with Aho, retire as a Hurricane. 2 big things are factored in on the order that I've got these guys in. 1, how easy they would be to move. And 2, what kind of return you would get for them. So if you do move Tony out, you're probably not getting much back. I wouldn't be surprised if the Hurricanes actually traded him just for the sake of getting his money off the books. That frees up $1.6 million in cap space. Maybe they retain a little bit of salary. But either way, the logjam is cleared up. Chatfield goes in the lineup. And then at that point, that's when the front office, Brendan Moore, whoever else, says to the team, hey, this is it. We have who we have. This is what we've got. Let's go with it. Let's get it sorted out. Let's go win some hockey games. Let's get to the postseason. Let's win a cup. As far as an actual return for DeAngelo, 5th rounder later pick, maybe you get a 4th liner, maybe you get a depth player out of it, but I don't think anybody's hurting bad enough for defense. I don't think that there would be a huge return for Tony DeAngelo at all. One of the messed up things that the Hurricanes have done to themselves with this excessive amount of defense that they've, by far the biggest drawback of it is teams that would potentially take one of these guys are always going to be able to say, what's in it for me? They know that the Hurricanes are looking to get one of these guys out of here. Elliot Friedman actually reported a few weeks ago the Hurricanes were shopping a defenseman, and Tony DeAngelo was number one on the trade block. So I don't think you get much of a return for Tony. Granted, it's not a very big cap hit. It's only $1.675. If you retain salary, it's not the end of the world, but you don't really get anything back for him. And we already know his defensive deficiencies, and we already know his reputation. And I think his reputation is held against him and blown wildly out of proportion, personally. But looking at him on ice, if a team needs someone to produce some scoring from the blue line, maybe the phone rings about him. That being said, there are also several offensive defensemen in this league who make more money than Tony DeAngelo that I trust way less defensively than him. John Klingberg, Tyson Barrie, Sean Durzi, Noah Hannafin, you name it. There's a lot of players who are a lot more defensively deficient than Tony DeAngelo and make more money and put up comparable numbers. So now, moving on to Jalen Chatfield, you get less of a cap hit. Also, like Tony, he has no trade protection. He's on an expiring deal, just like Tony is. But here's the big difference. You get the exact opposite of a player, basically. Chatfield doesn't give you a ton of offense. He's not someone you really expect to quarterback a power play, at least not yet. I think he could in the future. He does have a lot of good transition game and playmaking ability. And when he does shoot, got some velocity on his shot. But with Chatfield, more than anything, you get defense. Outstanding defense, well-timed pinches, great gap control, physicality, poke checking. That's what you get with Chatfield. You get everything with Chatfield you do not get with Tony DeAngelo. Although Chatfield is 27, he doesn't have a ton of mileage on him compared to guys who have been full-time NHL players up until this point. Chatfield was a late bloomer. He was undrafted. And the other thing that would probably make him really attractive to a lot of teams, you're getting a lot of dollar-for-dollar value with Jalen Chatfield. He signed a league minimum deal 2 seasons ago, $762,500. So teams that are kind of strapped for cap, maybe you could use that and say, hey, we have Jalen Chatfield, competent top 4 defenseman. So if you go up to a team that's maybe close to the cap, maybe you could extract some resources back. Maybe you get a forward coming back. Maybe you get a couple of high-end picks. I think Chatfield would be at least worth a third, especially to a team that would consider signing him long-term. Or if you get him on a sign-and-trade somewhere, then you could get even more assets for him. Chatfield is a much larger trade piece at a much lower cap hit. That being said, out of everybody that was listed on this board, DeAngelo included, I think that Jalen Chatfield is the safest long-term investment that the Hurricanes could make out of these 4 guys. The defense is there, the gap control is there, the physicality is there, and when he pinches, it's very decisive, it's very aggressive, he's good at keeping the play alive at the other end, and as much as his game is evolving, he's going to be a great penalty killer. He's going to start seeing more time doing that. And I think even long-term, once he learns a little bit more, he could be a power play option and start producing some more numbers 5-on-5. One of the biggest reasons I want Chatfield in the lineup over Tony DeAngelo is I see him being a long-term fit, and him not playing right now is not good. It's not good for his development. His development is in the last stages. What you see is what you get with Chatfield for the most part after, I'd say, about the next year. Out of all these guys, the one I would like to sign long-term is Jalen Chatfield. You get similar results that you would get to signing Brett Pesce as far as the on-ice. On probably less money and less term, you can get Chatfield for under $4.5 million, I would imagine. That's just a rough estimate on my part, and you could probably get him for about 5 years. This is also a guy that has the capability of potentially being on Nikishin's right side in a couple of years, or if the offensive side of his game develops enough, he could be paired with Slavin. Chatfield fits in this lineup in a lot of different ways, and I'm not just talking about the immediate future, but the foreseeable future. And that's the biggest reasons I would keep him. I think he has a long-term future with the team. So I'm going to talk about Pesce and Shea together here for a multitude of reasons. Both of these guys have some trade protection. In the case of Brady Shea, he has a modified no-trade clause with 10 teams. Brett Pesce also has a modified no-trade clause, but his is 15 teams. So whereas the previous 2 players we discussed with DeAngelo and Chatfield had no say whatsoever if they were to get traded, these guys have some control over their contract situations. Brady Shea I particularly would describe as a well-rounded 2-way defenseman. He's coming off a career season in terms of offense, and I think that his defense was exceptional last year as well. That was in no small part thanks to Brett Pesce, but The onus is on Brady Shea. He definitely knows how to use his frame and use his body to regain possession of the puck. And once he does have possession, he doesn't hesitate much about walking it up to the blue line before distributing a pass or just carrying it to the other end himself. Shea is also a really good possession player because he anchors himself to the ice and he's hard to take a puck away from. He gets very low in his skating stance, kind of like Patrick Kane does. He's got pretty good hands, and his biggest weapon offensively is that he can shoot, whereas on the defensive side of things, good positioning and body contact I feel like are his best assets. And in every aspect of the game, I think his speed is a little underrated. Brady Shea is actually really fast. He's an excellent power skater. Now, with Brett Pesce, you get stalwart defense. You get stalwart defense, consistency, really good agility, really good edge work, decent amount of speed, really good poke checking ability. Can also use his body to separate players from pucks, but prefers the poke checking route. Gives you a little bit more physicality than, say, someone like Slavin. Doesn't provide you a ton of offense. As a matter of fact, if I had to guess, Brett Pesce, albeit I wouldn't get in front of it because it's still probably 87 or 88 miles an hour, Brett Pesce might have the weakest shot on the team, but having the weakest shot on an NHL team, you still have a really hard shot. So when it comes to Brett Pesce, you definitely have a great 5-on-5 guy, a great safety valve for an offensive defenseman like Shea. Great penalty killing option, not someone you'd probably want to use on the power play. Whereas Shea, you can use him 5-on-5 power play or penalty kill. One of the reasons I would like the Hurricanes to hang on to him, he gives you a tertiary power play option. Now, if Shea continues at the offensive pace he's playing at, it's going to be hard to re-sign him anyway. And with what Pesce is allegedly asking for, I think the last I heard was 8x8. I like Brett Pesce a lot. I will eventually have a Brett Pesce sweater even if he's not with the team come next season. $8 million for 8 seasons is a lot for him. I think the Damon Severson deal was kind of what screwed up everything with Pesce. So I think that had that deal not went down, maybe you work out something along the lines of 6x6 or 6.5x6 for Pesce, which I think would be about right for him. I don't see us paying a defenseman on this team, not in the near term anyway, more than $8 million. The next defenseman on this team that I think will make $8 million is probably Jacob Slavin. So for both of these guys, you could get a decent haul back. Both of these guys, for example, we acquired Shea for a first-round pick. You would probably at least get a second back for him, if not more, if you just traded him straight up for a pick. With Pesce, picks coming back would be nice, but he's a homegrown asset. He was drafted and developed by the Hurricanes. That would be like driving a car to the 50,000-mile mark, and you've still got plenty of usage out of it, but then you trade it in for peanuts. You can't do that. If you trade Pesce in particular, you need to get a roster player back, preferably one with term or one that can likely be signed for term. So I have an argument for and against keeping both of these guys. One, with Shea, you get a steady presence of defense and steady production. Two, Brett Pesce is one of the best at what he does as being a shutdown defenseman, and one of the few players I rank ahead of him is also on this team in that of Jacob Slavin. And albeit this should not be a tangible factor, but it is a factor nonetheless, Brett Pesce has made it abundantly clear he wants to stay in Carolina. Should he be willing to take a pay cut for that? Sure. But another thing that I've noticed about Pesce, even though he looked a little bit off in the first few games, ever since he had that surgery and he's come back from it, he looks more and more like he's getting back to his old self and he's not lost a step as much as he did before. So I think whatever that injury was nagging Pesce, and that surgery corrected it, and now he's playing significantly better. So keeping him around long term is something that could be a lot more on the table. If you keep one, you have to strongly consider keeping both because how good of a pair that this is. Now, will that stand the test of time? Only time will tell. But if you can get Brett Pesce for under 6.5 for about 6 years a term, because that's the cool thing about a shutdown defenseman, a stay-at-home defenseman, whatever you want to call him losing a step is not nearly as consequential as Aho losing a step, or Kotkaniemi losing a step, or Svechnikov losing a step. It will be far more noticeable when those guys lose a step one day. Pesce just needs to keep being that steady presence on the blue line. And then he could be the guy that's on the right of Nikishin one day, or maybe Shea will still be on his left. There's a multitude of options there, but there's definitely a great case to keep him, but you could get a pretty big return for him. At one point in time, it was discussed trading Brett Pesce for William Nylander. You could potentially still make a deal like that. Maybe not for William Nylander himself, but a player of a similar caliber. Also, if Shea does not stay and you do manage to sign Pesce, you already know who you can put on Orlov's right. Because as I've stated on many occasions, Tony DeAngelo is one of my favorite players. He does not need to be paired with Dmitry Orlov. It is not working. Now, one thing to keep in mind, both of these guys are about to turn 30. That is something you have to be careful with, making a long-term investment with two players at that age. I don't think age will affect Pesce as much as it will Shea. But I think Shea is good enough defensively to where if he transitions to less of a puck-moving game and more of a playmaking game where he attempts to make stretch passes and doesn't join the rush as much and focuses on the defensive aspect of things, I think that a contract for Shea could age pretty well too. Brett Pesce basically just has to keep doing what he's doing, and I think that the biggest thing that he will do, as Jordan Eberle talked about in an interview a few weeks ago, he made some very intuitive remarks. As he gets older, he said it wasn't the way that he played that was changing, it was the way that he trained was changing. And I think in particular, if Brett Pesce does that and just keeps himself healthy, he'll be able to continue to do what he's doing for several more years. So now, to wrap this up, let me just put it this way. Imagine a few years from now, let's say Slavin and Pesce are still here, and you've got Nikishin, Morrow, and whoever else on the team. Imagine a world where your third pair is Brett Pesce and Jacob Slavin. They're both making, somewhere between $6.5 and $8 million. Slavin on the higher end of that, obviously. But they're your third pair, and combined, maybe they take up 6 or 7% of the cap. Because at 35 years old, respectively, Jacob Slavin and Brett Pesce is a third pair. If they're 85%, 75% of what they are now, is a great third pair, and it can kill penalties. And it can be that steady presence. And those guys, when they played as a pair, it was hard to get anything past them. If the Hurricanes ever had enough depth to put them back together when they're in their latter years, they will be just fine. Another thing to keep in mind with the potential of trading someone like DeAngelo, Chatfield, or Pesce, you also have Coghlan waiting in the wind. But more than that, you have Scott Morrow, who is finishing up, I want to say that he is in his senior year in NCAA. So the Hurricanes have to start thinking about making room for him to sign as well. From what I've seen of him, and I'm working on an analytical video of him just like the Nikishin one I recently put out, I don't foresee any problems that would keep him from making the team and being in the top 4. Not in the top 4 immediately, but I think he would be in the top 4 within a few seasons. I think he would be quarterback in the power play relatively early. I think that potential is there with him. So, as far as this season goes, this might be an unrealistic expectation on my part, but here's what I would like to see happen. 1, Chatfield comes in the lineup, signs long-term. 2, you try and work out the best team-friendly deal you can with Pesce and Shea, if possible. Tony, as far as the season goes, if you can convince him to stay on and be the healthy extra, he'll be good to have in the event that Bernsey gets hurt, because you can slot him right in with Slavin and you know what you're getting. But none of these are cut and dry solutions, but these are just all the ones that I see in front of me, and it's just stuff that's fun to, have theoretical discussions about and everything like that. You guys let me know what you think in the comments and everything like that, and I'll get back to doing a mailbag soon and replying to everybody as soon as I can. It's just, I felt absolutely awful the last few days, whereas now I'm feeling a lot better, so I'm going to go get some stuff taken care of before the game tonight. I will create a more extensive video on this topic and also what I think the Hurricanes could do to improve the forwards. As far as the topic of the defense goes, I'm going to discuss it more with the factor of Morrow potentially signing when his collegiate season is over and how that could potentially affect the team. But short-term solution, I think that Chatfield should be in over DeAngelo. I don't think the unlucky sevens pair is going to work. I just don't think it is. Orlov needs a safety valve. Tony needs a safety valve, and neither one of them can be that for each other. So that's all I've got for this video. So I just want to say one last time, all these guys are good hockey players. All of them have their merits. All of them have their place. I just don't think everybody is going to fit under the umbrella of the Hurricanes defense as it stands. So that's all I've got for this video. Y'all, thank you very much. I'm going to go take some Mucinex and get ready to watch the game. Y'all take care, and I'll see you next time.